In the autumn of 1997, an 8-year-old girl in Maple Ridge, Ohio, made a promise to her mother. It wasn't the kind of promise children usually make. Not about cleaning her room or finishing homework. Sophie Bennett looked up at her mother with those wide, serious eyes and whispered, "Promise you'll only read it if I tell you it's okay." She was talking about her diary. A small notebook with a tiny brass lock, no bigger than her palm. Corinne Bennett smiled, kissed the top of her daughter's head and said yes, she would wait, however long it took. 16 years later, Corinne would sit alone on the bedroom floor of a house she could no longer bear to live in, holding a small brass key she'd found stitched inside the lining of a stuffed rabbit. And she would finally understand why her daughter had hidden it there. But that's where this story ends. It doesn't begin there. It begins on a Tuesday evening in late August, with the sound of a piano drifting through an open window on Elm Street. Maple Ridge in 1997 was the kind of town where people still left their front doors unlocked. Population just under 9,000. A single traffic light on Main Street. A hardware store that had been in the same family for 3 generations. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone's name, or at least knew who their parents were. Crime existed, sure. Petty stuff. A broken window at the school. A stolen bicycle from the community center lot. Nothing that made anyone lock their doors at night. Sophie Bennett lived in a 2-story colonial on Elm Street with her mother Corinne and her father David. She was small for her age. With sandy hair she kept in 2 braids and a gap between her front teeth she was deeply embarrassed about. She'd been taking piano lessons since she was 6. Not because her parents pushed her, because she'd walked past Mrs. Callahan's living room window one afternoon, heard someone playing, and simply refused to leave until they signed her up. Every Tuesday and Friday, Corinne would drive her to Mrs. Callahan's house on Birchwood Avenue, 6 blocks from their front door. Sophie would practice her scales, stumble through a new piece, get corrected, pout a little, then beam when she got it right. After the lesson, she'd ride her blue bicycle home, a Huffy with a wicker basket on the front where she kept whatever treasure she'd found that day. A smooth river stone, a particularly interesting leaf. Once, an entire dead cicada she intended to show her father. David Bennett worked at the county assessor's office. Quiet man, wore the same rotation of button-down shirts, came home most evenings smelling faintly of coffee and printer toner. He and Sophie had a ritual. Every night after dinner, she'd sit on the kitchen counter while he washed dishes, and she'd narrate her entire day in exhaustive detail. Who sat next to her at lunch? What the substitute teacher said that was weird. Whether the class hamster had finally learned to use its wheel. David would listen, nod, occasionally ask a follow-up question. Corinne would sit at the table grading papers, smiling to herself. Sophie noticed things. That's what everyone said about her. Mrs. Callahan mentioned it once to Corinne after a lesson. She asked me why I moved the metronome 3 inches to the left. I hadn't even realized I'd done it. The mailman, old Tom Grady, told David that Sophie was the only kid on the route who could tell him when he delivered to the wrong house. She'll say, "Mr. Grady, that's the Henderson's paper, not the Newyens." And she's right, every single time. She kept a diary, started it the summer before 2nd grade. Corinne bought it at the drugstore on Main Street, a small thing maybe 4 inches by 5 with a pale green cover and a tiny brass padlock. Sophie treasured it, wrote in it every night before bed, pressed wildflowers between the pages, taped in ticket stubs from the county fair, drew little pictures in the margins. Corinne never asked to read it, never peeked. That promise mattered. September of 1997 arrived warm and golden. The kind of Indian summer that made you forget school had started. Maple trees along Elm Street were just beginning to turn at the edges. Sophie had just started 3rd grade. She was excited about it. She told her mother she wanted to be a veterinarian, then changed her mind to a pianist, then changed it again to someone who finds lost things. Corinne had laughed and said that sounded like a fine career. Friday, September 19th. The afternoon sun hung low and amber over Maple Ridge. Corinne dropped Sophie at Mrs. Callahan's at 4:15. The lesson ran until 5. Standard. Routine. Sophie would ride home, arrive by 5:10, maybe 5:15 if she stopped to look at something interesting along the way. Karen would be in the kitchen starting dinner. David would walk in around 5:30. At 5:10, Karen glanced at the clock. Nothing unusual. Sophie sometimes lingered. At 5:20 she glanced again. Still nothing. At 5:30 she stepped onto the front porch and looked up and down Elm Street. The sidewalk was empty. The street was quiet. A neighbor 2 doors down was watering his lawn. No blue bicycle. No small figure with sandy braids pedaling home. Karen told herself to wait 5 more minutes. 10. She went back inside, stirred the pasta water, checked the clock. 5:45. David walked through the back door, dropped his keys in the bowl, called out, "Hey, where's our girl?" Karen said, "She should have been home 20 minutes ago." David paused, looked toward the front window, looked back at Karen. Maybe she stopped at the park. You know how she gets with those flowers. Karen nodded, but something in her chest had already tightened. A small, cold knot. She grabbed her keys. "I'll drive over." She drove the 6 blocks to Mrs. Callahan's first. The elderly woman answered the door in her apron, confused. "Sophie left right at 5, Karen. I watched her get on that bicycle. She waved at me from the sidewalk." Karen drove the route home, slowly, checking every side street, every driveway. The small neighborhood park on Linden Avenue where Sophie sometimes stopped to press clover between her fingers. She found it there. The blue Huffy bicycle, leaning neatly against the wooden fence. Not thrown, not dropped, placed there carefully the way Sophie always parked it. The wicker basket was empty. No scratches on the frame. No signs of a struggle. No scuff marks on the pavement. Nothing. Karen stood in the fading light and called her daughter's name. Once, twice. A third time louder. A woman walking her dog across the park stopped and stared. Karen called again. The sound came back flat and small against the empty swings. She called David. Her voice when she spoke was steady in a way that frightened him more than screaming would have. "She's not here. Her bike is here. She's not." Within an hour, the Elm Street house was full of neighbors. Within 2 hours, the Maple Ridge police had 2 officers walking the park perimeter with flashlights. By midnight, 40 volunteers were combing the woods behind Linden Avenue. David was out there with them, crashing through underbrush, calling Sophie's name until his voice went raw. Karen sat at the kitchen table. The pasta had gone cold. She hadn't moved. Detective Ray Holloway arrived at the house at 11 that night. Mid-40s, tired eyes. He'd worked missing persons in the county for 11 years. He sat across from Karen and asked the questions he always asked. When did you last see her? What was she wearing? Does she have friends she might have gone to? Is there anyone at all, who might want to take her? Karen answered everything. The yellow corduroy jumper, the white tights, the red shoes with the scuffed toes. No, she wouldn't go anywhere with a stranger. No, there was no one, no custody disputes, no threats, no enemies. They were the Bennetts. They went to church on Sundays. They hosted the neighborhood barbecue in July. Nothing like this happened to people like them. Holloway wrote it all down. He didn't say what he was thinking. He'd seen enough cases to know that the first 48 hours decided everything, and the first 48 hours were already slipping away. By Saturday morning, the search had grown to over 100 volunteers. They walked the creek beds. They checked every storm drain. They posted flyers at every gas station and grocery store between Maple Ridge and the county line. Sophie's school photo stared out from every telephone pole. That gap-toothed smile. Those serious eyes. David didn't sleep. He couldn't. He drove the route from Mrs. Callahan's to the park over and over, as if repetition might produce a different result. As if Sophie might appear on the sidewalk, pedaling home late, laughing about some flower she'd found. Karen stayed in the house. She kept the front door unlocked. She kept Sophie's place set at the dinner table. She kept the porch light on. On Sunday afternoon, while Karen was folding Sophie's laundry because her hands needed something to do, she found it. The diary, tucked under the mattress of Sophie's bed where the girl always kept it. The small green notebook with the brass lock. Corinne held it in both hands, turned it over. The lock was shut. The tiny keyhole stared up at her like a closed eye. She thought about breaking it, a paperclip, a small screwdriver, anything. Her fingers tightened on the cover. Then she heard Sophie's voice, not in the room, in her memory, that quiet, serious whisper from over a year ago. "Promise you'll only read it if I tell you it's okay." Corinne set the diary back on the bed. She closed her eyes. She breathed. She would wait. And outside, the search continued. And the hours kept passing. And the little blue bicycle sat in an evidence locker downtown. And no one in Maple Ridge could explain why an 8-year-old girl had carefully parked it against a fence and then simply ceased to exist. If this story is holding you, take a moment to subscribe. Cases like Sophie's deserve to be remembered, and your support helps keep them in the light. The question that haunted Detective Holloway that first weekend wasn't where Sophie had gone. It was why the bicycle was parked so neatly. Children don't abandon their bikes in a panic. They drop them, they crash them, they leave them sprawled on the grass. Sophie Bennett had placed hers against that fence with the same care she used to park it in the garage every night, as if she'd stopped, as if she'd chosen to stop, as if someone she trusted had asked her to. And in a small bedroom on Elm Street, a locked diary sat under a mattress, holding secrets no one could reach, waiting for a key that no one knew existed, waiting for a girl who wasn't coming home to say it was okay. The first week after Sophie disappeared, Detective Holloway ran the investigation the way he'd been trained. Methodical, exhausting, every hour accounted for, every possibility chased until it dissolved or hardened into something usable. His team canvassed every house within a half-mile radius of Linden Avenue Park. They knocked on doors at breakfast, at lunch, at dinner. They knocked again the next day for anyone who hadn't been home. They asked the same questions on every porch. Did you see a little girl on a blue bicycle Friday afternoon? Did you see anyone talking to a child near the park? Did you notice a vehicle parked where it shouldn't have been? Did you hear anything unusual? Most answers came back the same. No, nothing. I was at work, I had the television on. I was in the backyard and didn't look toward the street. A few people remembered seeing Sophie riding past earlier in the week, always alone, always pedaling carefully, her braids bouncing, her basket rattling. No one remembered Friday. Holloway pulled traffic camera footage from the 2 intersections nearest the park. Maple Ridge didn't have many. The footage was grainy, shot from a fixed angle that covered the road but not the sidewalk. They watched hours of it, cars passing, a school bus, a delivery truck, nothing that matched a child on a bicycle, nothing that showed Sophie arriving at the park or leaving it. The bicycle itself told them almost nothing. No fingerprints beyond Sophie's and her parents'. No fibers, no hair, no blood. The chain was clean, the tires showed normal wear. The wicker basket had been emptied, but there were no scratches suggesting anything had been torn from it. Forensics processed it twice. The second time they found a single smudge of blue paint on the chain link, not the blue of the bicycle frame. A different shade, automotive. They logged it, bagged it, and filed it with the rest of the evidence. At the time, no one thought much of it. Paint transfers happened. A bike leaned against a fence. A chain brushed a car bumper in a parking lot. It meant nothing yet. On the 4th day, Holloway brought in the children. Sophie's classmates, kids from the neighborhood who played at Linden Avenue Park after school. He didn't interview them at the station. He went to the school, sat in the counselor's office and spoke to them one at a time with a child psychologist present. Gentle questions. No pressure, just conversation. A boy named Tyler, 9 years old, sat in the chair across from Holloway and swung his legs because they didn't reach the floor. He remembered Sophie. Everyone remembered Sophie. She was nice. She let him look at her pressed flowers once. She told him the Latin name for a dandelion and he'd thought she was showing off. "Did you ever see Sophie talking to anyone at the park?" Holloway asked. "Anyone she didn't go to school with?" Tyler frowned, thought about it. There was this guy, older, like really old, maybe 50. He shrugged. He was nice. He talked to Sophie a couple times, maybe 3. I saw them by the swings. What did he look like? Tyler's face scrunched. I dunno, tall, I guess. He wore a hat, a blue one like a baseball cap, and he had a thing around his neck like a camera, one of the old ones. Did he talk to you? No, just Sophie, and maybe that other girl. I don't remember her name. Holloway wrote it down. Blue cap, camera, older man. He asked Tyler if he could describe the man's face. Hair color, build, anything. Tyler shook his head. He was just a guy. He smiled a lot. Sophie seemed fine. She wasn't scared or nothing. 3 other children gave similar accounts. Fragmented, uncertain. A nice older man near the park, always smiling, always wearing a hat. One girl remembered he carried a camera. Another said he'd given Sophie a flower once. A real one, not pressed. A bluebell, she thought. None of them could describe his face clearly enough for a sketch artist. He was just a presence. A background figure in their afternoons. An adult who smiled at kids and didn't seem threatening. In a town like Maple Ridge, that wasn't unusual. That wasn't alarming. Holloway filed the reports. He noted the consistency. 4 children, separate interviews, all mentioning the same general figure. But without a face, without a name, without a vehicle description, it was a thread he couldn't pull. Then Mrs. Patterson came forward. Dorothy Patterson was 63, retired. She'd carried mail on the Linden Avenue route for 22 years before her hip gave out in '95. She still walked the neighborhood every afternoon out of habit. Old routes die hard. She'd seen the flyers on the telephone poles. She'd seen the search volunteers. And something had been nagging at her for days, a memory she couldn't quite place. She called the tip line on a Wednesday evening. Holloway called her back within the hour. "It's a car," she said. Her voice was slow, careful, the voice of someone trying to hold on to a shape before it dissolved. A station wagon, dark green, maybe forest green. It was parked near the park, not in the lot, on the side street. Elmwood, I think, every Friday. Every Friday. For a while, maybe 6, 7 weeks before the little girl went missing, I'd see it there when I did my afternoon walk, always the same spot, always Friday afternoons, around 4:30. I noticed because it wasn't a neighborhood car. I know every car on my old route. That one wasn't from here. Did you ever see who was driving it? Mrs. Patterson paused. Once, maybe twice. A man getting out, but I was across the street. He was just getting out of the car, walking toward the park. I didn't look close. Why would I? It's a quiet street. People park, people walk. Could you describe him? Medium build, not fat, not thin. He wore a jacket even when it was warm. And a hat, I think blue, I'm not certain. It was a while ago, detective, I'm sorry. I should have said something sooner. I just didn't think it mattered. Holloway thanked her. He pulled vehicle registration records for dark green station wagons in the county, then the surrounding counties, then the state. The list was long. Station wagons were common in '97. Dark green was a popular color. Without a plate number, without a make or model, the list was a haystack. He ran it anyway, cross-referenced every name against the sex offender registry, against complaints involving children, against employment records near Maple Ridge. Nothing matched cleanly. The green station wagon remained a ghost. By the 3rd week, public pressure was mounting. The local news ran the story nightly. Sophie's face was on every screen in central Ohio. The governor's office issued a statement. The FBI offered assistance. And then a name surfaced. Gerald Dunn, 41, local handyman, lived 3 streets from the park, had done repair work at Mrs. Callahan's house the previous spring. 2 prior complaints involving children, not charges, complaints. A mother in the next town over had reported him for lingering too long at a school pickup zone. Another family said he'd offered to help their daughter with a stuck bicycle chain and the girl had felt uncomfortable. Nothing criminal, nothing prosecutable. But enough to put him on a list. Holloway brought Dunn in for questioning. The man sat in the interview room with his hands flat on the table and his shoulders hunched. He denied everything. Yes, he knew who Sophie was. Everyone did. She rode past his house. No, he hadn't seen her that Friday. He'd been at a job in the next county. He provided the name of the homeowner. They confirmed it. He'd been there until 6. But the complaints, the proximity, the timing, Holloway couldn't let it go. He obtained a warrant for Dunn's home, searched it top to bottom, found nothing. No photographs of children, no blue cap, no camera, no green station wagon in the driveway. Dunn drove a rusted Ford pickup. Still, the public wanted a suspect. The news wanted a suspect. Dunn's name leaked. Within days, his windows were broken. Someone spray-painted a word on his garage door. He lost 3 clients. His wife moved to her sister's house. Holloway ordered DNA testing, fibers from Sophie's bicycle, hair samples from the park, anything that might connect Dunn to the scene. The results came back 6 weeks later. No match, not even close. Every fiber was consistent with Sophie's own clothing. Every hair belonged to Sophie or to the volunteers who'd trampled the park during the search. Gerald Dunn had nothing to do with Sophie Bennett's disappearance. The DNA cleared him absolutely. Holloway drove to Dunn's house on a gray November morning to tell him. The man answered the door in a stained undershirt. His eyes were flat, empty. Holloway said the words, "You're cleared, there's no evidence connecting you." Dunn nodded. Didn't say thank you, didn't say anything, just closed the door. The investigation lost its strongest suspect on a Tuesday in November, and with Dunn cleared, the case didn't just stall. It hollowed out. The leads that remained were whispers. A blue cap no one could describe. A green station wagon no one could identify. A nice older man who existed only in the uncertain memories of 8-year-olds. David Bennett stopped sleeping entirely. He took leave from the assessor's office, then he quit. He spent his days driving, not the route from Mrs. Callahan's to the park. He'd already driven that 100 times. He drove further, to neighboring towns, to rest stops along the interstate, to every park, every school, every piano studio within 50 miles. He carried Sophie's school photo in his breast pocket. He showed it to strangers at gas stations, at diners, at truck stops. "Have you seen this girl?" over and over, his voice growing hoarser each week. Corinne watched him come apart. She couldn't stop it. She couldn't reach him. He'd sit at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning with maps spread out, drawing circles, calculating distances, muttering to himself. She'd stand in the doorway and say, "David, come to bed." And he'd look up at her with eyes that didn't quite focus and say, "I'm close, Corinne. I can feel it, I'm close." He wasn't close. They both knew he wasn't close, but saying it aloud would break something neither of them could repair. The diary stayed under Sophie's mattress. Corinne hadn't moved it, hadn't opened it, hadn't tried to. She'd made a promise to an 8-year-old girl, and she intended to keep it. Even now. Even with the house quiet and the porch lights still on and the place at the dinner table still set. If you're still following Sophie's story, consider subscribing so this case doesn't fade from memory. Winter came to Maple Ridge. The search volunteers stopped coming. The flyers on the telephone poles faded and curled. The news crews moved on to other stories. Detective Holloway kept the file open, kept the evidence boxed, kept the green station wagon on a list that grew longer and more useless by the month. And in a small bedroom on Elm Street, a locked diary waited in the dark. Its brass catch gleamed faintly in the glow of the porch light that Corinne never turned off. Inside its pages, pressed between entries about piano scales and school lunches and the names of wildflowers, something was waiting. Something Sophie had written down because she was 8 years old and observant and careful. Something that would matter, but not yet, not for a long time. The question that kept Holloway awake that winter wasn't who took Sophie. It was simpler than that, and somehow worse. 4 children had seen her talking to a man in a blue cap, a man with a camera, a man who smiled, and not one of them could tell him what his face looked like. As if he'd been standing in plain sight the entire time and no one had truly seen him at all. The years that followed didn't pass so much as accumulate. Like sediment, like weight pressed slowly onto a chest until breathing became a conscious effort. David Bennett searched for his daughter for 6 years, not metaphorically, not in the way people say they're searching for answers. He searched, physically, relentlessly. He drove an estimated 40,000 miles across Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania. He visited every missing child database, every support group, every conference. He learned the names of other families, other children, other empty bedrooms. He sat in church basements drinking bad coffee, listening to mothers describe the particular silence of a house where a child's shoes still sit by the door. Karen went with him at first. Then she stopped, not because she'd given up, because she couldn't watch him disappear into the search the way Sophie had disappeared into that Friday afternoon. He was leaving her, not physically. He still slept in the same bed, still ate at the same table, but his eyes were always somewhere else, always scanning, always calculating. He stopped hearing her when she spoke, stopped noticing when she cried, stopped noticing when she stopped crying, which was worse. They fought, not loudly, not with thrown plates or slammed doors, quietly, in the kitchen at midnight, in the driveway after he came home from another dead-end drive. "You can't keep doing this, David. And you can just sit here, you can just wait." "I'm not waiting, I'm living. Someone has to keep this house standing." He'd look at her like she'd said something cruel, and maybe she had, and maybe he had. Grief made them into strangers who shared a mortgage. In the spring of 2003, David Bennett collapsed in the driveway of a stranger's house in Dayton, Ohio. He'd been showing Sophie's photo to a woman who answered the door. The woman later told police he'd simply stopped mid-sentence. His hand went to his chest. His knees buckled. He was on the ground before she could reach him. Massive heart attack. He was 46. Karen drove to Dayton to identify him. She sat in a hospital corridor for 3 hours before a doctor used the word gone. She nodded, signed papers, drove home, walked into the kitchen, set her keys in the bowl where David used to drop his, stood there for a long time. Then she turned off the porch light for the first time in 6 years. She didn't sell the house. Couldn't. Every room held something. Sophie's piano in the corner of the living room, its lid closed, a thin layer of dust on the keys. David's map still pinned to the study wall, his circles and roots faded to ghosts. The kitchen table with its one extra place setting that Karen had never removed. She moved through the rooms like a curator in a museum no one visited. The diary stayed under the mattress. Karen checked on it sometimes, lifted the corner of the mattress, looked at the small green cover, touched the brass lock with her fingertip, never tried to open it, never looked for the key. The promise held. 10 more years passed. Karen turned 60. Her hair went silver. She retired from teaching. The neighborhood changed. Young families moved in. Children she didn't know rode bicycles past her window. She watched them from the kitchen and felt something crack and resettle in her chest every time. In the autumn of 2013, Karen decided to sell the house. It wasn't a sudden decision. It had been building for months. The roof needed replacing. The furnace was failing. Her pension couldn't cover both. And the house had become a mausoleum she maintained out of obligation rather than love. She called a realtor, agreed to a listing date, began the slow, agonizing process of sorting through 26 years of accumulated life. She started with Sophie's room. She'd avoided it for years, cleaned it, yes, dusted, changed the sheets mechanically, but she hadn't truly entered it, hadn't opened the closet, hadn't touched the stuffed animals lined up on the shelf, hadn't picked up the small ceramic horse Sophie had made in second-grade art class. On a Thursday afternoon in October, Karen sat on the floor of Sophie's bedroom with a cardboard box and a roll of packing tape. She worked slowly. Each object required a decision. Keep, donate, throw away. Each one was a small violence. She wrapped the ceramic horse in newspaper, placed it in the keep box, picked up a stack of old notebooks, school worksheets, a spelling test with a gold star. She smiled. Her eyes burned. She kept going. Then she reached the shelf. The stuffed animals, a worn teddy bear, A cloth dog with one button eye, and the rabbit, Sophie's favorite, a pale blue stuffed rabbit, soft and flattened from years of being hugged. Its ears were floppy. Its stitched smile had faded. Sophie had named it Clover. Corinne remembered. She'd won it at the county fair the summer before she disappeared. Corinne picked up Clover, held it in her lap, pressed her thumb into the soft fabric of its belly, and felt something. A small hardness beneath the stitching, not the stuffing, something else, something flat and solid sewn into the lining. Her hands trembled. She turned the rabbit over, examined the seam along its back. The stitching was different there, not factory work. Hand-sewn, small, careful stitches in thread that almost matched the fabric. Sophie's stitches. Corinne recognized them. Sophie had been learning to sew that summer, practicing on everything: pillowcases, dish towels, the hem of her favorite skirt. Corinne found a seam ripper in the kitchen drawer. Her fingers shook so badly she dropped it twice. She worked the stitches open one by one. The fabric parted, and there, tucked inside a small pocket of lining, was a brass key. Tiny, no bigger than a thumbnail, tarnished with age. The diary key. Corinne sat on the bedroom floor and stared at it in her palm. 16 years. It had been here the entire time. Hidden inside the one toy Sophie loved most. Not lost, not misplaced. Hidden, deliberately, carefully, by an 8-year-old girl who had sewn it shut with her own hands. Why? The question hit Corinne like a physical blow. Why would Sophie hide the key? Why not leave it in the drawer where she'd always kept it? Why sew it inside Clover, where no one would think to look unless they were taking the house apart? Corinne didn't answer the question. Not yet. She stood, walked to the mattress, lifted it. The diary was there, green cover, brass lock. She carried both to the kitchen table, set them down, sat. The key fit the lock perfectly. A small click. The cover opened. Corinne's hands were steady now. She didn't know why. Maybe because she'd waited so long that the waiting had burned the tremor out of her. She turned the first page. September 2nd. First day of 3rd grade. Mrs. Patterson's class. Sophie wrote about her new desk by the window, about a boy named Marcus who chewed his eraser, about the smell of new crayons. A small pressed clover was taped beside the entry. Corinne turned the page, and the next, piano lessons, a recital coming up, a sleepover at her friend Jenna's house, a family trip to the zoo where the elephant sprayed water and David got soaked and Sophie laughed so hard milk came out of her nose. Normal, all of it. The ordinary, beautiful, unremarkable life of an 8-year-old girl. Corinne read for an hour, too. The afternoon light shifted across the kitchen table. She turned pages carefully as if they might dissolve, and with each page a quiet disappointment settled into her. This was Sophie. This was her daughter's voice, but there was nothing here. No warning, no fear, no stranger. Just a child documenting her small world with the earnest precision Corinne remembered. She reached the middle of the notebook, and the handwriting changed. Not dramatically, not the way a forger might alter letters, but the pressure shifted. The words pressed harder into the page, the sentences grew shorter, and a name appeared. Mr. Blue. September 5th. Mr. Blue was at the park again today. He said he likes my flowers. He said I have good eyes for finding pretty things. September 9th. Mr. Blue showed me his camera. He said he takes pictures of kids who are lonely. He said lonely kids need someone to remember them. I told him I'm not lonely. He laughed and said everybody is a little lonely. September 12th. Mr. Blue gave me a bluebell today, a real one. He said bluebells mean kindness. He said we're playing a kindness game. I don't really understand the rules, but he said that's okay. He said the rules are for grown-ups and I don't need to worry yet. Corinne's breath stopped. She read the entries again. Slower. Mr. Blue, no real name, no description beyond the name itself, just a presence. A man who helped people who were lonely. A man who played games with children. A man who gave flowers and smiled and asked no questions that seemed dangerous. She turned another page, And there, taped carefully beside an entry dated September 14th, was a drawing, crayon, child's work, a baseball cap, blue, drawn in careful, deliberate strokes. Below it, Sophie had written, "This is Mr. Blue's hat. He wears it every time, even when it's sunny." Corinne stared at the drawing, her throat closed because she recognized it, not from memory, from the evidence file. Detective Holloway had shown her photographs during the first week, items collected from the park search. A blue baseball cap found in the grass near the swings, unremarkable, common. The kind sold at any gas station or hardware store. It had been logged, photographed, and dismissed. No one had connected it to anything. No one had made it public. But Sophie had drawn it. Exactly. The same shade. The same small tear on the left brim that Corinne remembered from the evidence photo. The same faded logo she couldn't quite make out. Sophie had seen that cap, had looked at it closely enough to draw it, had drawn it in her diary and locked the diary and hidden the key inside a stuffed rabbit. Corinne picked up the phone. Her fingers found the number for the Maple Ridge Police Department. She asked for the cold case unit. She said, "My name is Sophie Bennett. My daughter disappeared in 1997. I need to speak to someone about her diary." Before I continue, if this story matters to you, subscribing helps ensure it reaches the people who need to hear it. Detective Maria Santos received the call on a Friday afternoon. She'd been with the department for 9 years, had worked cold cases for 4. She'd seen the Sophie Bennett file during her first week. Everyone had. The case that haunted the department. The one no one solved. She drove to the Elm Street house that evening. Corinne met her at the door, led her to the kitchen table, set the diary down between them like a fragile living thing. Santos read it, all of it. Corinne sat across from her, hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea, watching the detective's face change. Page by page, entry by entry, the shift from piano recitals to Mr. Blue, the careful observations, the pressed flowers, the drawing of the cap. When Santos finished, she looked up. "This cap," she said, "the one she drew, you're certain it matches the evidence?" Corinne nodded. "The tear on the brim, the color, I remember the photograph. David and I went through every piece of evidence they showed us. That cap was in the pile. No one thought anything of it." Santos closed the diary gently. "Mrs. Bennett, I'm reopening this case." She took the diary to the evidence lab, photographed every page, cataloged every pressed flower, transcribed every entry, and then she noticed what Holloway's team had missed 16 years earlier, or perhaps what they'd seen but hadn't connected. Every entry mentioning Mr. Blue fell on a Friday, September 5th, September 12th, September 19th, the day Sophie vanished, Fridays, piano lesson days, the days Sophie walked those 6 blocks alone. Santos pinned the dates to her board, stared at them. A pattern, simple, clean, terrifying in its clarity. Whoever Mr. Blue was, he hadn't stumbled upon Sophie by accident. He'd been there every Friday, waiting, building trust, playing his kindness game 1 week at a time. And Sophie had noticed, had written it down, had locked it away, had hidden the key. But there was more. Corinne, reading the diary again alone that night, noticed something the investigators hadn't. Several pages had tiny pressed wildflowers taped beside the Mr. Blue entries. Not clover, not dandelions, something else. Small, pale blue flowers with narrow petals. Corinne didn't recognize them. She photographed them and sent the images to the botany department at the State University. The answer came back 2 days later. The flowers were Mertensia virginica *, Virginia bluebells. They bloomed in early spring along moist woodland trails. Specifically, the response noted, they grew in dense clusters along the Old River Trail 3 miles outside Maple Ridge, a trail that hadn't been maintained in years, a trail most residents had forgotten existed. Corinne stared at the email. Sophie had pressed those flowers, had taped them beside entries about Mr. Blue, which meant Sophie hadn't just met him at the park. She'd been somewhere else, somewhere with wildflowers, somewhere along a forgotten trail by the river. Santos organized a search of the river trail the following week. 12 officers, 2 cadaver dogs, ground crews with probes and flags. They walked every inch of that overgrown path, through the mud, through the tangles of dead brush, under the canopy of oaks that blocked the October sun. They found nothing, no remains, no clothing, no personal effects. The trail gave up no secrets. But at the end of the search, as the team was packing up near a small clearing, an elderly woman appeared on the porch of a weathered farmhouse 100 yards from the trail. She'd been watching them through binoculars. She walked over slowly, leaning on a cane. "You're looking for that little Bennett girl," she said, not a question. Santos nodded. The woman's name was Ruth, 81, lived alone, had lived there for 50 years. She remembered the search in '97, remembered the volunteers crashing through the woods, remembered thinking they were looking in the wrong places. "I saw her," Ruth said. Her voice was thin but steady. "The little Bennett girl, riding that blue bicycle, maybe 3-4 weeks before she went missing. She was on the trail, but she wasn't alone." Santos went still. "Who was with her?" "Another little girl, about the same age. Dark hair, I don't know her, never saw her before or after. They were riding together, laughing. And there was a man walking behind them, tall, wore a blue hat, had a camera around his neck. He was taking their picture." "Did you see his face?" Ruth shook her head. "He was facing away, toward the girls. I only saw the back of him and the hat and the camera." "Did you report this in '97? Ruth's jaw tightened. "I called the tip line, told them what I saw. They asked if I was certain. I said I was certain about the hat and the camera. They said they'd look into it." She paused. "No one ever came back." Santos wrote it all down. A second child, dark-haired, unknown, riding with Sophie on the river trail, accompanied by a man in a blue cap with a camera, a man who matched every fragment the children at the park had described, a man no one had ever identified. The question that kept Santos awake that night wasn't who Mr. Blue was. She was getting closer to that. The question was the second girl, the dark-haired child no one had ever reported missing, no one had ever identified, no one had ever connected to Sophie Bennett. Who was she, and where was she now? Finding the second girl took 3 months. Santos started with the obvious. Missing child reports in Maple Ridge and surrounding towns between 1995 and 2000. Dark-haired girl, approximately Sophie's age. Nothing matched. No family had reported a dark-haired child missing in that window. Not in the county, not in the state database, not in the National Registry. Which meant the girl hadn't disappeared, or hadn't been reported, or had been told not to tell. Santos went back to Ruth. The elderly woman couldn't describe the child's face, too far away, too long ago, but she remembered one detail she hadn't mentioned before. The girl had been wearing a red coat, bright red, and she'd been carrying a small backpack with a cartoon character on it, a rabbit maybe, or a bear. Ruth wasn't certain. Santos pulled school photographs from every elementary school within 15 miles of the river trail, 96 and 97. She and 2 junior detectives spent 4 days in a basement office at the department flipping through yearbooks, faces, hundreds of them, smiling, gap-toothed, braced. On the 3rd day, a detective named Acaffer paused on a page from Westfield Elementary. A 2nd-grade class photo, a girl in the back row, dark hair, serious expression. Name printed below, Natalie Voss. Santos tracked Natalie Voss through public records. She was 24 now, lived in Columbus, worked at a veterinary clinic, had no criminal record, no connection to Maple Ridge that appeared on paper. Santos drove to Columbus on a Tuesday morning in January, knocked on the door of a small apartment near the university. Natalie answered, tall, dark hair pulled back, wary eyes. Santos showed her badge, said the name Sophie Bennett, watched the woman's face. Natalie went very still. Her hand tightened on the door frame. She didn't speak for a long moment. Then she stepped back and said, "Come in." They sat at a small kitchen table. Natalie poured coffee with steady hands, but her knuckles were white around the mug. She waited for Santos to ask the question. "You knew Sophie Bennett," Santos said. Natalie nodded. "Not well, not like a friend. We met through him." "Mr. Blue." Natalie flinched at the name, looked down at her coffee. "That's what Sophie called him. I called him Mr. Blue too. He told us to. He said his real name was for grown-ups and we didn't need it. He said we were playing a game. A secret kindness game. He said the game was about helping lonely people feel seen. He said if we told adults they wouldn't understand. They'd ruin the game. They'd take it away." "And you believed him?" Natalie's jaw worked. "I was 7. He was kind. He brought us flowers. He took our pictures. He said we were special. That we noticed things other kids didn't. He made us feel like we were part of something important." She paused. "He told us the game had rules. Rule 1 was secrecy. Rule 2 was that we could only play on Fridays. Rule 3 was that we never ever told our parents." "Did he ever hurt you?" Natalie shook her head quickly. "No, not like that. He never touched us wrong. He just talked, took photos, asked us questions about our families, our routines, where we went after school, what time our parents came home. He made it feel like a game, like a scavenger hunt. Answer the questions, get a flower, get a photo taken, get told you're doing a good job." Santos let the silence sit. "Why didn't you come forward in '97, when Sophie disappeared, when the whole town was searching?" Natalie's eyes filled. She blinked hard. "Because I was scared. He told us the game was secret, and then Sophie was gone, and I thought if I told, they'd know I'd broken the rules, that it was my fault somehow, that I'd let something happen to her by playing." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "My parents never knew. I never told anyone, not until right now." "Did you see him the day Sophie disappeared?" "No, I wasn't in Maple Ridge that Friday. My grandmother was sick. My mom took me to Dayton. I found out about Sophie from the news. I was 7. I sat on my grandmother's couch and watched them show her picture and I couldn't breathe." Santos asked about Mr. Blue's appearance. Natalie closed her eyes, concentrated. "Tall, thinner than I remember now. He wore a blue baseball cap, always, and he had a camera, an old one, not digital. The kind with a big lens you had to wind. He wore it around his neck on a strap. He was always fiddling with it, adjusting the lens, winding the film." "Could you describe his face?" Natalie tried. She gave Santos a jaw shape, a nose. The color of his eyes, maybe gray, maybe green. It was enough for a rough composite, not perfect, but more than anyone had produced in 1997. Santos brought the composite back to Maple Ridge. She pulled the original case file from storage. 3 boxes, dusty. The evidence photographs from the first search weekend. Hundreds of them. Volunteers in the woods. Volunteers along the creek. Volunteers standing in clusters near the park, holding clipboards and thermoses. She spread them across a conference table, looked at every single one, and on the 43rd photograph she stopped. The image showed a group of volunteers near the park entrance. Most faced the camera, smiling, tired, holding coffee cups. But in the background, slightly apart from the group, stood a man, facing the search area, not the camera. He wore a blue baseball cap, a canvas jacket, and around his neck, clearly visible, hung an old film camera on a leather strap. He was smiling, not at the photographer, at the search. As if he belonged there, as if he were helping. No one had noticed him. In '97, volunteers weren't required to register. They showed up. They walked the woods. They left. No names, no sign-in sheet, no ID check, just neighbors helping neighbors, and one man who wasn't a neighbor, who was standing close enough to watch everything, to see what they found, to see what they missed. Santos ran the composite through facial recognition. The system returned 11 possible matches. She worked through them. One by one, interviews, alibis, employment records, every single one cleared. Wrong age, wrong build, wrong state during '97. She was about to shelve the search when Okafor noticed something in the employment databases. One of the cleared matches, a man named Gerald Fitch, had a pattern. He appeared in records for 2 or 3 years, then vanished. No forwarding address, no tax filings, no utility bills. Then he'd reappear in a different county under the same name, working a new job, then vanish again. Every 3 to 4 years, like a cycle, like a routine. Santos pulled Fitch's full employment history. What she found changed the shape of the entire investigation. Gerald Fitch hadn't lived in Maple Ridge in '97. He'd never been a resident. He'd worked for a company called Bright Moments Photography, a traveling operation that provided photographers for children's events, school picture days, library summer programs, community fairs, church picnics. Fitch had been assigned to events throughout central Ohio between '94 and '99, temporary contracts, 2 or 3 weeks in one town, then the next, then the next. He'd never been considered as a suspect because he wasn't local, wasn't in the database, didn't appear on any Maple Ridge utility bill or voter registration. He was a ghost who passed through, smiled at children, took their photographs, and moved on. Santos pulled Bright Moments scheduling records from a storage facility in Akron. The company had closed in 2004, but the paperwork survived. Boxes of contracts, assignment sheets, invoices. Fitch's assignment log for the summer and fall of '97 showed him working an event at the Maple Ridge Community Library, 2 blocks from Mrs. Callahan's piano studio, every Friday afternoon, from 4 to 6. The exact window of Sophie's piano lessons, the exact window of her disappearance. He hadn't been passing through. He'd been stationed there, week after week, positioned 2 streets from an 8-year-old girl who walked home alone. Santos expanded the search. She contacted departments in every county where Fitch had worked between '94 and '99. She asked a simple question. Were there any missing child cases in your jurisdiction during the period this photographer was assigned to your area? The answers came back over 3 weeks, and they changed everything. A 9-year-old boy in Ashland County, '95, disappeared after a library reading program, never found. A 7-year-old girl in Marion County, '96, vanished after a church picnic, never found. An 8-year-old boy in Richland County, '98, gone after a community fair, never found. 3 cases, 3 counties, 3 children who attended events where Gerald Fitch had quietly worked. No one had ever connected them. Different jurisdictions, different detectives, different years. The same photographer in the background of every one. Karen received the news in her kitchen. Santos sat across from her and laid it out carefully. The name, the pattern, the other children. Karen listened without interrupting. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her face was very still. When Santos finished, Karen said quietly, "Did he take the others too?" Santos didn't answer. She didn't need to. That night, Karen sat at the kitchen table with the diary. She'd read it a dozen times since opening it, but tonight she read it differently, slower, looking for what she'd missed. And on the second-to-last page, she found it. A page folded differently from the others, not creased, folded into a small square, tucked between the binding and the previous page. She unfolded it carefully. A hand-drawn map, crayon and pencil, child's work, lines and curves, small circles marking spots, no street names, no labels except one. A tiny X near the bottom with the words "Old Train Place" written beside it in Sophie's careful handwriting. Santos studied the map the next morning. At first it looked meaningless, a tangle of lines, but she overlaid it with a street map of Maple Ridge and the surrounding area. The lines weren't roads, they were shortcuts, walking paths between places Sophie visited. The park, the piano studio, a friend's house, the river trail, and one route drawn in red crayon ending at a point 3 miles east of town. The old train depot, abandoned since the '70s, a crumbling brick building on a dead-end road, windows boarded, roof half-collapsed, the kind of place kids explored on dares and adults forgot existed. Santos obtained a warrant. Ground-penetrating radar swept the depot floor, the basement, the surrounding ground. Nothing. No remains, no buried evidence, no hidden compartments. The building gave up nothing physical. But the records office gave up something else. A rental agreement from March of 1997. The depot's small storage annex, a concrete room at the back of the building, had been leased for 6 months. The name on the lease was Thomas Weller. The address was a P.O. box in Akron. The signature didn't match any Thomas Weller in state records. Santos cross-referenced the P.O. box. It had been registered to Bright Moments Photography, the company Gerald Fitch worked for. The storage room had been rented under a false name, through his employer's mailing address, 3 months before Sophie disappeared. And then the paint. A forensic analyst named Yoon, reviewing the original evidence boxes for the reopened case, pulled the bicycle chain from its bag. 16 years in storage. The chain had been processed twice in '97 and cleared both times, but Yoon looked at it under a different microscope. Higher magnification, different lighting, and there, embedded in the link joints, were microscopic flecks of blue paint, not the bicycle's blue, not the park fence's blue, a different shade, automotive, industrial. Yoon ran the paint through the FBI's automotive coding database. The match came back specific. The pigment and binder composition matched a factory finish used on a limited production run of commercial delivery vans, a Ford Econoline variant, manufactured between '93 and '96, painted a specific shade of fleet blue. Only 312 units had been produced in that color. Bright Moments Photography had owned one. It was listed in their company vehicle inventory, assigned to their Central Ohio route, the route Gerald Fitch drove. The paint on Sophie's bicycle chain matched the van Gerald Fitch drove. It was the strongest physical evidence in the case, the first tangible thread connecting a specific person to the scene. Santos stood before her board, the photograph of the man in the blue cap, the employment records, the other children, the depot rental, the paint, the diary, the river trail, the second girl. It all pointed to one man, one pattern, one quiet, smiling photographer who moved through small towns like weather, leaving children behind him like fallen leaves. They had him, they had his name, his face, his method, his vehicle, his pattern. But Karen, reading the diary one final time that evening, turned to the last page, the final entry, and one sentence stopped her cold. "If he asks again next Friday, I'm going to tell Mom first." She read it again. Then she looked at the date Sophie had written at the top of the page, September 26th, 1 week after the disappearance, 1 week after Sophie had vanished on September 19th. The entry was dated in the future. Karen stared at the page. Her hands went cold. Something was wrong with the timeline. Something Sophie had done deliberately. Something that changed everything they thought they understood about that last Friday. And the answer to what it meant was sitting in the diary, in the handwriting of an 8-year-old girl, waiting for someone to understand why she'd lied about the date. Santos brought the diary to a forensic document examiner the following week, a woman named Dr. Lyon Park, who worked out of a small office attached to the state crime lab. Park examined the final entry under magnification, studied the ink, the pressure of the pencil, the way the numbers had been written. "The date was altered," Park said. She pointed to the top of the page. "See here. The original numeral was a 9 for the 19th. She wrote over it, changed it to a 6, made it the 26th. The ink layering confirms it. The 9 was written first. The 6 was added later. Different pressure, slightly different angle." Santos stared at the page. She changed the date herself. Yes, deliberately and carefully. Whoever did this wanted it to look natural, like the entry had been written on the 26th, not the 19th. Karen, sitting in the corner of the lab, spoke quietly. She was afraid he'd look. Santos turned to her. "Sophie told me once," Karen said. Her voice was thin, steady in the way it got when she was holding something very heavy. She said Mr. Blue sometimes watched her write in the diary at the park. He'd sit on the bench nearby and she'd write and he'd lean over and say, "What are you writing about, Sophie?" And she'd close it and say, "Just school stuff." But she told me he looked at the pages, not every time, but sometimes. She said he had peeking eyes. The room was quiet for a moment. Santos sat down, opened her notebook, wrote nothing, just sat. The picture reassembled itself, slowly, piece by piece, like a photograph developing in chemical bath, the image emerging from blankness. Sophie hadn't written that final entry on September 19th. She'd written it before, maybe the 17th, maybe the 18th. She'd written it as a plan, a decision. If he asks again next Friday, I'm going to tell Mom first. Next Friday, the 26th, the Friday after the one she was writing on, she was planning ahead, giving herself a week. One more Friday of the kindness game. One more Friday of Mr. Blue and his camera and his bluebells. And then she would tell Corinne. She would break the rule. She would end the game. But she'd changed the date, made it look like the entry belonged to the 26th, because if Mr. Blue peeked, if he leaned over with his peeking eyes and saw the words, "I'm going to tell Mom," he would know. He would know the game was over. He would know she was about to break the silence he'd built so carefully, one Friday at a time. So she'd lied to the diary, made it look like she hadn't decided yet, like the decision was still a week away, like he still had time, like the secret was safe for 7 more days. She was 8 years old, and she'd outthought him. Except he'd found out anyway, or he'd suspected, or he'd simply decided that Friday, September 19th, was the day. The last day. The day before she could tell. The day before the game ended and the adults came and the careful, patient work of months dissolved. He'd been at the park, waiting, as he waited every Friday, and Sophie had ridden up on her blue bicycle and he'd asked her to stop, to come closer, to look at something. A flower maybe, a bird, something an 8-year-old with good eyes for pretty things couldn't resist, and she'd parked her bicycle neatly against the fence, because that's what Sophie did. She parked neatly. She placed things carefully. She pressed flowers between pages and taped them down and wrote their names in small, precise letters. And then she was gone. The paint on the chain, the van, the depot, the storage room rented under a false name, the blue cap in the grass, the camera around his neck, the green station wagon Mrs. Patterson saw every Friday, the river trail, the bluebells, Natalie Voss in her red coat and her 7-year-old silence, the other children in Ashland and Marion and Richland counties, the pattern, the patience, the quiet, smiling man who moved through small towns like a season no one noticed until it was already over. Gerald Fitch, born 1951 in Youngstown, Ohio, worked for Bright Moments Photography from 93 through 99, traveled a route through central Ohio. School pictures, library events, community fairs, church picnics. He set up his backdrop. He adjusted his lens. He smiled at children. He wound the film. He asked them to hold still. And between the photographs he talked. He listened. He learned their routines, their walks home, their parents' work schedules, their small, trusting secrets. He died in 2009. A car accident on a highway outside Tucson, Arizona, alone. No family listed on the report, no next of kin. He'd been working under a different name by then, a maintenance job at a storage facility. No photography, no children's events, just a quiet man in a quiet town who kept to himself and changed jobs every few years and left no trace behind. He was 58. He'd been dead for 4 years by the time Santos opened the diary. The case was officially closed in the spring of 2014. The evidence was sufficient, the employment records, the paint match, the depot rental, the witness testimony, Natalie Voss's account, the diary, the photograph from the search weekend, the pattern across 4 counties. The state attorney general's office reviewed the file and concurred. Gerald Fitch was identified as the person responsible for the abduction of Sophie Bennett and the disappearances of 3 other children in central Ohio between 1995 and 1998. No charges were filed. There was no one to charge, no trial, no courtroom, No moment where Karen could look across a room and say his name to his face. The resolution came in a manila folder delivered to the Elm Street house by Detective Santos on a rainy April morning. A summary, a conclusion, a closing statement. Karen read it at the kitchen table, set it down, folded her hands, sat for a long time. Natalie Voss drove to Maple Ridge for the press conference. She stood at the back of the room, didn't speak to reporters, didn't give interviews, but afterward she found Karen in the parking lot, two women, one who'd lost a daughter, one who'd carried a secret for 17 years. Natalie said, I'm sorry I didn't tell, I was 7 and I was scared and I'm sorry. Karen looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached out and took Natalie's hands, held them, squeezed. You were a child, Karen said. You don't owe me an apology, you owe yourself one, and I think you've already paid it. Natalie cried. Karen didn't. Not then. She cried later, alone, on the kitchen floor, with the diary open in her lap and Clover the rabbit beside her and the small brass key on the table where it caught the afternoon light. She cried for Sophie, for the 8-year-old who'd noticed everything, who'd seen the peeking eyes and understood what they meant, who'd changed a date in a diary to buy herself a week of safety, who'd sewn a key into the belly of a stuffed rabbit because she knew, with the quiet certainty of a child who watches the world more carefully than adults realize, that someday someone would need to find it, that someday the diary would matter, that someday the flowers and the drawings and the small, precise observations would speak for her when she couldn't. Karen never got the reunion she'd spent 16 years hopping for. No knock on the door. No small figure with sandy braids walking up the driveway. No voice saying, Mom, I'm home, and you will not believe what happened. That hope had died slowly over years in a house with the porch light on and a place set at the table. What Karen got instead was understanding, and for a long time she wasn't sure that was enough. But it grew, slowly, like the bluebells Sophie had pressed between the pages, small and pale and persistent. She sold the house in the summer of 2014, moved to a small apartment near her sister in Dayton, took the diary with her, and Clover, and the ceramic horse from second-grade art class, and the kitchen table which didn't fit in the apartment so she gave it to a neighbor, but she kept the place setting. One plate, one fork, one small glass. She kept it in a cabinet, didn't set it out. Didn't need to. The setting existed. That was enough. Santos stayed with the department for another 6 years, worked cold cases, kept Sophie's file on her desk, not in the cabinet. A reminder. She retired in 2020, volunteered at a children's literacy program on weekends, read picture books to kids who fidgeted and picked their noses and asked the same question 14 times. She never minded. The other families, the boy in Ashland, the girl in Marion, the boy in Richland, they received the same manila folders, the same closing statements, the same quiet, insufficient word identified. For some of them, it was the first answer they'd had in 20 years. For others, it reopened wounds they'd spent decades trying to scar over. There was no justice in the legal sense, no sentencing, no prison, no public reckoning, just a name in a file and a dead man in an unmarked grave in Arizona. But the names of the children were spoken, in a report, in a press conference, in a documentary that aired on a Tuesday evening to a few million people who sat in their living rooms and felt something shift in their chests. Sophie Bennett, the boy in Ashland, the girl in Marion, the boy in Richland. They were not forgotten cases. They were not statistical anomalies. They were children who noticed things, who pressed flowers, who rode bicycles, who trusted a smiling man with a camera because he told them they were special, and who deserved to be remembered by name. Karen kept the diary on her nightstand, not locked. The brass catch hung open. She read it sometimes, not often, not the whole thing, just a page here, a page there, the entry about the cicada, the one about David getting soaked by the elephant, the one about Mrs. Callahan moving the metronome 3 inches to the left, the small, ordinary, irreplaceable record of a girl who paid attention. And sometimes, late at night, she'd turn to the last page, the one with the altered date, the one with the sentence that changed everything. If he asks again next Friday, I'm going to tell Mom first. She'd read it, touch the pencil marks with her fingertip, feel the slight ridge where Sophie had pressed harder, writing the 9, the smoother stroke where she'd covered it with the 6, the small, deliberate act of an 8-year-old protecting herself the only way she knew how. Sophie had planned to tell. That was the truth that mattered most. Not that she'd been taken. Not that a man in a blue cap had waited by a park fence on a September afternoon. But that Sophie had decided, had made her choice, had written it down in her careful handwriting and hidden the key and trusted that someday, somehow, the right person would find it and understand. She hadn't known it would take 16 years. Hadn't known her father would die searching. Hadn't known her mother would sit on a bedroom floor with a seam ripper and trembling hands. Hadn't known a detective named Santos would pin dates to a board and notice the Fridays. Hadn't known a forensic analyst would look at a bicycle chain under a different microscope. Hadn't known a woman in Columbus would finally say the name Mr. Blue out loud after 17 years of silence. She'd known only that the diary mattered, that the key mattered, that the flowers and the drawings and the small, precise observations mattered, that if she wrote it down carefully enough, locked it away safely enough, hid the key well enough, the truth would survive, even if she didn't. Corinne closed the diary, set it on the nightstand, turned off the lamp. Outside her window, the street was quiet. A bicycle passed, the soft tick of tires on pavement, a child's laughter, distant and fatting, the ordinary sounds of an evening in a small town where people still left their doors unlocked, where a girl with sandy braids used to ride home from piano lessons with a wicker basket full of treasures, where a porch light burned for 16 years because a mother couldn't bear to turn it off. The light was off now, the door was locked, the diary was open. And Sophie's voice, small and steady and impossibly clear, filled the quiet room one last time. Not with fear, not with the name of the man who took her, but with the name of a flower, taped carefully beside a Tuesday entry in September, pressed flat between the pages, still holding its color after all these years. Bluebell Mertensia virginica *, it means kindness. Sophie had written that down too.